Robert, before we start talking about Cumbria itself, I'm just curious to know, you were a painter in the 50s, and what was it that made you turn to sculpture as your practice?
Well, it was a piece of sculpture. I worked in the city planning office in Saskatoon just before I moved to Mexico in 57, I guess it was. At any rate, when I got to Mexico, I heard from the planning department, and they said that they were, well, I knew they were commissioning a piece of sculpture or something to go in an elevated pool near the new part of the city hall. And I'd recommended John Nugent, who was the only sculptor I knew in Saskatchewan. Maybe one other fellow, I just forget. But at any rate, when I got down there, they contacted me and said, "You had the most to say of anyone we talked to about what we should do. Why don't you take a shot at it?" And then that was the same summer that Barnett Newman came to the Emma Lake workshop. So at any rate, I hit it off with Barney. We became good friends, and he looked at my paintings and said, before he'd seen the sculpture in Saskatoon, or the model, he said, "Have you ever made any sculpture?" So he could somehow see an imagery or something there. But
Cumbria has quite a long history, and it was first shown in Toronto during 1967 for the centennial year, I believe.
Lippincott and I had just built, Lippincott being Donald Lippincott, who had the fabricating plant in North Haven, Connecticut, which was the first fabricating plant that I'm aware of that only worked with sculptors. Cumbria had just been finished. Dorothy Cameron, I think, selected Cumbria for the show, or we offered it to her. So it was probably one of the bigger pieces to be in the exhibition. And Don and I went up to Toronto and assembled and repainted it on the grounds of the City Hall. And almost immediately after it went back to New Haven, it was loaned to the City of New York. There was a woman called Doris Friedman. I think this may have been one of her first outdoor efforts, but she, under the Lindsay administration, she was kind of the art czar and organized everything from city walls to sculpture being sited throughout the city on a temporary basis. So my piece went to Battery Park.
And how did it get to the Vancouver airport?
Well, the MOT in Canada were on the leading edge of the 1% program, and all the new airports had to include works of art, and it had to, I guess it was a 1% of their overall budget or some part of the budget. So a fellow came down from Ottawa to Battery Park to look at the sculpture. I suggested to him, since he was involved with aviation, that he take the helicopter from Kennedy, and there was a helicopter pad right there at the tip of Manhattan. I said, "You can walk across the street and see the sculpture." He said, "Oh, no, we couldn't do that. Government employee, all this stuff." I don't know how he probably got in by dog team, but he eventually showed up at the sculpture and walked around the sculpture once and then said, "How do I get to Macy's?" I said, "Macy's department store?" He said, "Yeah, I need a summer suit." So I happily took him, got him a cab, told the cab driver to take him the best possible route to Macy's, and got rid of the guy. Well, I talked to Lippincott. We owned the piece jointly. I talked to Lippincott in New Haven, and I said, "Don, I don't know how it's gone." I told him what happened. And I said, "It'll be a miracle if it ends up going to Vancouver." But eventually we were contacted. And I love to tell this part of the story because they offered us quite a bit less than the asking price of the piece. And we'd explained that to begin with, there was no dealer's commission, so they were saving themselves 20% to begin with. So I said to Don, "Let me talk to them." I called somebody at MOT and thanked them for selecting the piece, and said I was looking forward to seeing where we would put it in the new airport. And I said, "By the way, this is not the price that the sculptor had on it." He said, "Yeah, well, it's used." So I said, "Like a Rembrandt." I said, "It's supposed to be worth more." At any rate, the long story we came to an agreement. They didn't pay our price, but they paid quite a bit more than than they thought they were going to pay for. And then it came to Vancouver. When we first installed the sculpture, the whole area was wide open. Then there was a shell station built. I had to make them take their sign down because it was the same yellow as my sculpture. And I was there first. Then the parking got bigger and bigger and bigger. But the real reason that it left the airport, as you all know, is because the airport was purchased by a consortium of businessmen from the government. And so it became a privately owned airport. And somebody decided that they should get rid of all the modern art, as they called it, and only show native art. Well, I'm very sympathetic to native art. One of my good friends was Bill Reed. But nonetheless, we felt it was not the best way to handle the work. Tony Onley knew a young woman who worked for the airport authority, and she said, you know, Bob's sculpture's been taken down. So Tony came out and took a look at it, and he let us know, and that's the first we heard about it. Tony actually found out who I should contact, and both Lippincott and I came out to look at the work. And it had been seriously damaged because of the way it had been taken apart. I later met the fellow who did it, and he was chagrined to find out that when he was sent out with his backhoe or his bulldozer to remove the sculpture, that he was actually dealing with a fairly valuable piece of art, and to him it was just a more of a deconstruction problem, and so he did what he was told. He knocked it apart, and they bent the heck out of it.
Its siting at UBC when it arrived was between the Lasserre building and the Belkin Art Gallery. How was that particular site determined?
It seemed to be a logical place to put a big piece of sculpture between the Belkin Art Gallery and the Art and Architecture building.
Of the cultural context.
Yeah, it was rather confining and a bit low down. That sculpture benefited from, because it has this kind of inclination to the sky, you want it to look like it's rising up into the sky, basically. So it's got the horizontal element that's played off against the diagonal elements, the two diagonal elements, and the intent behind that was to sort of, even though it's heavy and it's on the ground, was to make it look light and as if it could take off. That was all determined when I built the sculpture, because we didn't know it was going to end up in an airport for part of its life. But it was an appropriate piece for the airport because it had this kind of quality to it.
When you originally created the sculpture, it wasn't necessarily for a particular project. You and Lippincott seemed to just go ahead to create it?
Well, we didn't know where these pieces were going to end up. Part of the motivation for Don getting his operation going is that a number of sculptors had complained in print that we were too dependent on getting a commission in order to do a big piece. And in those days, often the parameters of a commission were very confining. Sometimes the architects themselves weren't very sympathetic, didn't like us plugging up holes in their creations, as somebody said to me once. But the Don's idea was to work out a relationship with the sculptor so that he would take up the burden of the material costs and the fabricating costs, and then we had a cost-sharing arrangement when the piece got sold. So those of us who had ambitions and were interested in doing big sculpture didn't have to pay for it in advance. And that was a huge boon. And then, of course, what happened immediately thereafter is that people started borrowing work for downtown exhibitions. And I traveled all over North America following semi-trailers with my work on it for a number of years. And most of it wasn't to museums, a few exceptions, but most of it was to downtown spaces where people decided they wanted to have a show. And of course it was well covered by Time and Life and Architectural Digest and so on. And there was an excitement in the air about this kind of activity. And then it led to things like sculpture parks and sculpture areas adjacent to museums or included in museums. I think the modern museum had that little sculpture garden. That was that's about the only one I know of that predated what we were doing. But I met an awful lot of sculptors who were also involved in these shows. Don would be the last guy in the world to take any credit for this, but his insight into getting his business going and the way he operated, and then we began to really depend on him because he got an engineer on board, because often the contracts that we had to deal with demanded an engineering analysis of the piece for wind loads and weight distribution and tie downs and stuff, and then he also in many cases got truckers together and then would send his men out to supervise an installation. So there were some sculptors who didn't realize how spoiled they were. And then when Don closed his operation a few years ago, I had to take a welding course. When I lived in New York, you couldn't have welding equipment where I live, so I didn't learn how to do all of those things.
So Don, it seems Don worked with you, Don and his crew, I guess, worked with you in order to produce it. He was also in charge and took care of all the transportation and all of the other costs. I mean, that's quite, talking about amazing support.
His son has done a book called Big Scale. He's also now working on a book on my work, but Jonathan Lippincott produced a book called Big Scale, Sculpture in the 60s and 70s, fabricated sculpture in the 60s and 70s. And it talks about this coincidence of, well, a coincidence in this sense that it was like a chain reaction because the work was there, and he had a big field beside his plant in North Haven, and people used to come there from all over the place and look at work, and what we all liked about it and what Don appreciated is people were dealing with the real thing. And the inherent characteristics of a piece were right in front of you, so it wasn't some hypothetical thing that somebody did on the back of a napkin. This that people could get right up to the work and see it. Matter of fact, Mark DeSuvero was telling me that some of the first pieces he had at Lippincott's they didn't make, but Don gave him permission to store them there in the field. And they were eventually all bought. Matter of fact, they went to Storm King, the art center on the Hudson River that has this amazing outdoor sculpture park. And Don is still providing them with work. So even though the place is kind of closed down, it's run now by his younger brother, but they don't use the original facilities. They use other fabricators in the New England area because sculptors work with so many different materials now. But I guess I should say one other thing, and that's about the material. This piece is made out of Corten steel. Corten itself became a big vogue, and it was largely because of Don. And how we got introduced to Corten was through Don's father, who was the Lippincott of Lippincott and Margulies, a big industrial design firm in New York, and one of their clients was U.S. Steel. And U.S. Steel was looking for an interesting use of their Corten. So the funny kind of chain reactions that you have to kind of pinch yourself to think about in retrospect.
So it has been in a number of different locations, and do you feel that changes the viewer's perception of the piece?
Oh, definitely, because it gives the sculpture a context, and for good or bad. And I spend a lot of my time these days working with people like Keith, trying to find a better location for work. A couple of my friends who used to make what they called site-specific sculpture, I used to caution them, don't make it too site-specific because the site's going to change. And I think with almost no exceptions, every time I've moved a work or helped move a work, it's gotten better because of what we've learned about the piece. Cumbria, as I said earlier, was an interesting problem in that we had to find a fabricator. Didn't make sense to send it back to New Haven because it's a pretty costly process. So we decided it would be better to rebuild it do what we had to rebuild the piece locally, and then that would solve one of the major transportation problems. So Lippincott and I had several meetings with the people at Murray Latta, and among the 5 other people that we interviewed, they seemed to be the most sympathetic and had the equipment. They had a big brake press that could bend 2 or 3 inch steel. So, do you know what a brake press is? It's a big hydraulic device that has a long bed, and it can have various configurations. It's usually like a V groove, and then it has a long blade in the upper part of it, and it moves up and down on hydraulic pistons. And you put the metal in there, and then you bring it down, and then you can create a bend in the metal. And then Lippincott's guys and I figured out how we could make all kinds of eccentric forms by putting an extension on the end of the brake so you could get at it, so you didn't run into the frame of the machine. And so Murray Latta seemed open to ideas like that. Now, the bending on Cumbria is fairly elemental compared to later works of mine. It got very complicated. Partly because we figured out how to do it, so I had to try it.
What were your hopes for the viewer's experience in encountering this work?
Well, you're never quite sure about that, and you're never quite sure how much of your intentions are the piece is going to convey. But in fact, this is true of all sculpture, even figurative sculpture. I discovered early on that a lot of the park sculpture commemorates people who don't look like the sculpture, and their horses don't look like the horses they rode. But no one seems to care. It's General Lee on a horse, and so everybody salutes and walks by. So what people will take away from a work is always fascinating to me. I sometimes tell students that the trouble with being an artist is that you seldom get any feedback, sort of maybe from except the odd review. I said, if you feel that's important, you should become actors, because you get applause at the end of a performance and you know how you've done. But I said with artwork, you work alone, you put it into a place, it lives there by itself for 2 or 3 weeks, and you're not entirely sure what anybody thinks about it. But the work has content, but it doesn't have meaning in the Victorian sense, where something looked like something else, or you had that form of reference. I would say that's the main difficulty people have in appreciating contemporary or abstract art, is that they are used to seeing a representation of something that's based on another kind of experience. But with abstract work, the piece is itself, and it's what happens within the piece that is the subject of the piece. So it's not without a subject, it's just a different kind of subject. And I appreciate the fact that that can be difficult, for people, especially if they don't know much about the area. It always surprises me on one level, because if you do know something about the history of sculpture, where things go is not so illogical. One move kind of grows out of another, or someone tries something else. So Cumbria became known generically as a minimalist piece of sculpture. And why was that the case? I don't know why anybody called it minimalist, but it somewhat captured the idea that motivated a lot of us, including people I didn't meet until some of these shows. We discovered we were all throwing all of the extraneous stuff out the window and trying to get down to the basic moves of the piece. So a lot of my work relies on just 1 or 2 simple moves within the piece. But I get a lot of pleasure out of the fact that it makes a hell of a complicated thing. It changes as you walk around it. It changes when you look down on it. And if people will take the time to look at it, there's an awful lot going on. But with Cumbria, there's the 2 diagonals that hopefully look like they're ascending, and they're counterbalanced by the long horizontal. And it's that kind of play-off between one thing and another. Well, you see, now I'm giving it a subject. That's the subject of the piece. Well, when I first moved to New York, some of the people I got to know were people like Merce Cunningham and John Cage and so on. and you know, they were coming out of a Stravinsky tradition. I mean, you know, and achordal music. I mean, there's a lot of things going on that gave that work a particular kind of milieu. You know, it just didn't hit me like a bolt of lightning. It was because of a lot of things that were going around around me. And one of the other motivations for me, I guess, having come out of painting, was that I don't relate my sculpture so much to other sculpture as I do to color field painting. And the bigness of color field painting and the amount of color and the area of color. You know, Barney Newman once said that the blue on a particular painting of his was not the same blue that was in the can. Mm-hmm. And what he meant was the amount of the blue and the way the light struck it, you know, made it into a color. It was paint in the can. It was color on the canvas. And those kind of, you know, they don't seem like earth-shaking ideas, but they were earth-shaking ideas at the time. If you see what was going on, you know, before, was what I kind of grew up into, was to get sculpture back to sort of basic moves and to get people focused on the essential form.